Which bits of HR do you think still need to be worked on?
It's not about HR. HR is about the business. Whatever we do is to create impact on the business and to bring ROI or results, or in the public sector to see a certain kind of achievements. So HR is really about transformation. Our role has evolved so much, and that we really now need to get all these HR functions in the SMEs up to speed.
Welcome, Jacqueline Lee, to the Rolling Stories podcast. It's great to have you here. I would preface our discussion today by just looking at your career. And I was stalking you on LinkedIn. Apologies for that. But it is a fairly long and illustrious career, starting back in 1990 with Olivetti, then a year or so with General Motors, the National Kidney Foundation for a couple of years, LaSalle College, NEC, back into corporate world, NEC and Certis. And then from 2009, the Singapore University of Technology and Design. I did also notice, Jacqueline, that in that time, you've managed to fit in a PhD in information systems, a Master of Business, a Master in Human Resources, and of course, your original degree. So the first part of the discussion this morning is I'm just curious about, well, first of all, how you got into HR, and secondly, what HR looked like in the early 90s.
So I kind of stumbled onto HR by accident. One day when I, was reading the newspaper, I saw an advertisement. Just reading through, and I saw this job for a personnel and employee relations officer at Olivetti. And the only reason I got in is not because I have HR background, it's because they needed someone with a psychology degree, because the job was really working on the shop floor with the production operators. So while I was busy on the shop floor, so I did, my job was really counseling, talking to the employees, maintaining harmonious relationship between labor and management. And also part of my job was doing employee welfare newsletters. And can you imagine how we did newsletters those days? It was so arcade.
Did you even have a word processor or?
Yeah. Olivetti was still manufacturing typewriters at that time, but we were already manufacturing personal computers.
But what I am curious about is from the overall HR function point of view, whether it's Olivetti or GM, how was it set up? Can you recall back that time, how the overall HR function? I guess there's a bit of payroll in there. They may even had some training. Do you remember a little bit about how for those two companies anyway?
Philip, I don't think the functions have varied very much, because I remember that we had this labor relations. In a manufacturing plant, the labor relations was very key. So we had a unit that looks after employee union management, because we had collective agreements. We had the labor unit. It was a unionized company. And then we had the usual compensation and benefits. We had recruitment. So the traditional functions were still there. It's just that the method of doing was very manual. Pace of life is slower, speed slow. I had a lot of time at that time to just talk to people, and they will come into my office, and people will come into the manufacturing shop floor and just talk to me, telling me their problems, So it was very slow. I would say life was much slower.
That's very interesting about your role of counseling employees, whether it's sort of formally or explicit or implicitly, because I think that was do you agree? I think that was quite progressive for a company back then. It does occur to me that in this day and age, employees don't actually have that person to confide in and so forth, right? As I said, maybe it's the HR business partner, but do you think it is actually a potentially a missing thing in modern HR functions?
I would say that today it is something that probably does not really exist anymore. During the early days, because there was, in manufacturing, there definitely are a lot of labor relations issues, and was very important to have harmonious relationship between the workers and management. In those days, the manufacturing plant, the workers were all from China. My job is just to make sure that they're comfortable, they're happy. It was strange that other employees, white collar employees, began to come in and tell me their problems, So I became like an in-house counselor, Yeah.
As we move on through your career, then, so we now get to sort of the second half of the 90s and butting up against the 2000s. Anything that sort of strikes you that 10 years later that was different, or that you remember from the time as interesting?
So, of course, we move on to General Motors, and General Motors was actually a very progressive company. And GM have their own technology for email messaging within, it's like a server, in-house server. So at that time, we were already using electronic messaging. After that, I believe I moved on,
National Kidney Foundation.
the National Kidney Foundation. During those days, were using video, VHS tapes. So we were buying those tapes and conducting training sessions using video tapes, VHS tapes. So it was quite arcade. Yeah.
So as we said, the slow transition from analog to digital, right? So yeah, videotape somewhere in there makes absolute sense.
And those days in Kidney Foundation, again, things were very paper-based. Computers were existing at that time. They were kind of the very old type of computers. And then you kind of print out into the printer, and then you kind of photocopy and circulate the email. So that was how slow it was. Yeah. Analog again, yeah.
All the big software companies that we know and love now were still fairly nascent then, and it was all about ERP systems and whatever. But if you did think back, what's the first company you worked for that actually had a sort of robust HR system?
I would say NEC Corporation. It's a huge company, 150,000 employees. I really enjoyed myself there quite a fair bit. I was there for 4 years, and I believe that at that time already the internet has arrived. It arrived. I remember having my first email account in 1996. But those days, of course, in the company you have broadbands, right? But the speed was much slower, you would say. And the systems again were very disparate. They were kind of standalone systems. They didn't talk to one another. So you had a payroll system, and then you would have a record keeping system for all your P files, for all your personnel data, and a leave system, a system for applying leave. So it was kind of very basic, easy pay, the kind of very basic system.
As you said, I think we all started to get email addresses at the end of the 90s, but the first part of the 2000, I agree. The systems are getting a little more sophisticated. We're now, well into the 2000s. So for the remainder of that decade, from a progression point of view here, anything that sticks out in terms of the way HR was evolving and changing? Anything else stick out for you in that first decade of the new millennium?
I remember that time I was working for LaSalle from 1995 to the year 2000. And at that time, of course, you have all this Y2K issues. So I was busy trying to manage the Y2K. Then as you move into, of course, the year 2000s, where I started to move into NEC, the transformation of HR has changed. There was already that business partnering role. So we already had, of course, email systems and all that. So things were definitely a lot more progressive. And I believe that the HR function that I was leading, we were already having quite progressive HR practices. Like I was basically the regional HR business expert for the region. I was leading the balance scorecard. So I was kind of doing a lot of this coordination for South Asia, and we were doing, of course, traveling between the countries, and then we had a lot of basically projects on skills, inventory skills development. So you can see that during that early 2000s, HR was becoming a lot more important. Although like I hear say that Japanese are kind of have pushbacks and they are quite resistant to basically accepting progressive practices. I happen to work for pretty progressive bosses, Japanese bosses, and this term regional business HR expert came from one of my Japanese CEOs. He wanted to form centers of excellence, and he wanted Asia Pac, South Asia headquarters, which is in Singapore, to be the center of excellence for the region. So we have HR, we have other kind of areas. So I was the center of excellence for HR. I would say that I really sought and I really grew, and I learned a lot from the company itself because it was so big.
So education is obviously quite a different animal to corporate, and I know you would have had some experience with LaSalle College then. But do you want to just sort of give us your entry point into SUTD? And I guess it's a quite a long time to spend with one employer for nearly 12 years. What was your entry point, and what sort of kept you there?
So before SUTD, I was with a company called Certis, right? And I did a lot of transformation work there. It was really I would say that the peak of my HR career, because it was a huge company with at that time 30,000 employees in the region. We made a lot of strategic impact onto the business. So that's where I spent about 4.5 years in Certis. And because of the work I did in Certis, I got an award for leading HR leader from the Singapore Human Resource Institute. And after that, it was kind of interesting. I was approached by the Ministry of Education. And from there, I had met up with the Deputy Secretary. And he says, hey, we're starting up this new university with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. It's a collaboration. Would you be interested to come in and start up the HR function? And that's where I found that was so exciting. I like transformation work. He says that you're going to come here and you're going to start from scratch. Nobody except you alone. Would you be comfortable rolling out your sleeves? I said, bring it on. So I joined, basically one person, I had nobody. We started from there, and there was literally nothing there. That was how nascent the operation was, and we grew it to what it is today. Today we have 1,000 over employees from zero, and we are basically have a couple of thousand students, and we are basically now quite a reputed university in the area of technology and design. And we have international faculty, we have a huge research group. So it's kind of grown from nothing. That's why it's been exciting for me.
So in HR employee number one, and you've built the function, and as you said, the academic and support staff and admin staff now numbers over 1,000 people for SUTD.
Yes.
I agree. I mean, that's an interesting journey to get an organization to stand up and then to build it out. Clearly what's kept you there. The last couple of things then, Jacqueline, with that maturity and the evolution of HR, I still see HR lacking in most organizations. I mean, if you thought HR still had some way to go in terms of its broad remit to support the business, I mean, which bits of HR do you think still need to be worked on?
HR is not about HR. HR is about the business. Whatever we do is to create impact on the business and to bring ROI or results, or in the public sector to see a certain kind of achievements. So HR is really about transformation. Our role has evolved so much, and that we really now need to get all these HR functions in the SMEs up to speed. That's why the government is through Enterprise Singapore providing a lot of grants for automation, for HR consultation, for HR learning roadmaps, to bring in this kind of practices into the smaller companies, which really has an urgent need to transform. And also with the setup of the IHRP, of which I'm one of the members of one of the committees in the Institute for Human Resource Professionals, we're trying to now aggressively step up accreditation and getting all our HR colleagues out there to come for certification, because that really gives a stamp of proficiency on the HR function.
Final question. Again, given your long career, would you offer 2 or 3 bits of advice? And they could be, if I had my time again, I wouldn't do this, or just 2 or 3 things that you would give as advice to someone getting into the HR area.
My passion for me is in HR. I love what I do. I think my fire has even grown stronger even today. And I think it's such a wonderful profession because you're impacting lives. I always tell my HR colleagues and my team that HR is not about HR, it's about the heart. You need to have a heart for people. So I would say that for people listening in, really is a function that needs you to be very strategic, needs you to partner with the business, and but needs you to also have a heart for the people on the ground. We are there not just for the business, but we are there, for our employees, and we need to be a voice for the employees. And nowadays, there's so much micro learning. So the idea is that you can't wait for the companies to train you. You have to train yourselves. You have to go onto all these micro learning sites or online platforms. Like what I did was a lot of the things I did was self-driven. I didn't have company sponsorship, but I had the support of my bosses. And these are all initiated by myself to continue to learn. So my idea is lifelong learning. Continue to sharpen your edge. Be a good partner. Be a voice for the employees on the ground, and just have a heart for what you're doing. Yeah, I think those are key points.
That's a good way to wrap up. And again, I do appreciate you taking the time to join us this morning. Jacqueline Lee, thank
Happy
you.
to do that. Thank you.